1944 arrived. The world was weary from war. Years of fighting had taken their toll. Yet the tide was turning. The Allies were gaining strength. The year 1944 and 1945 would be the final act of World War II. These years were marked by fierce battles and staggering losses, but they were also years of incredible bravery and determination. The Allied forces fought tirelessly to liberate Europe from Nazi control. In the Pacific, they battled to push back the Japanese. The world watched with bated breath. The outcome of these battles would determine the fate of nations. It would reshape the world order. Most importantly, it would decide the future of freedom itself. June 6, 1944, dawned with a mix of hope and trepidation. The early morning light cast a serene glow over the English Channel, belying the monumental events about to unfold. As the sun rose, it illuminated the vast armada of ships and landing crafts, each carrying brave souls ready to face the unknown. On this day, Allied forces launched Operation Overlord, a meticulously planned and highly secretive mission that had been in the works for months. The soldiers, sailors, and airmen knew the stakes were high, and the success of the operation could turn the tide of the war in favor of the Allies. This was the largest amphibious invasion in history, involving over 156,000 troops from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other Allied nations. The sheer scale of the operation was unprecedented, with thousands of ships, aircraft, and landing crafts converging on the beaches of Normandy. The primary objective of Operation Overlord was to liberate France from Nazi occupation. For years, the French people had endured the harsh realities of life under German control, and the Allies were determined to free them from this tyranny. The operation was codenamed D-Day, a term that has since become synonymous with courage, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of freedom. The meticulous planning involved countless hours of strategizing, coordination, and preparation to ensure the success of this critical mission. Thousands of ships crossed the English Channel towards the beaches of Normandy, carrying soldiers, vehicles, and supplies essential for the invasion. The sight of the vast armada moving as one was both awe-inspiring and a testament to the Allies' resolve. On board were soldiers from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other Allied nations, each with their own stories, fears, and hopes. These men came from different backgrounds and walks of life, united by a common goal: to defeat the Axis powers and restore peace to the world. They faced a heavily fortified enemy with German bunkers and strongholds strategically positioned along the coast. The Germans had spent years fortifying these positions, anticipating an Allied invasion and preparing to repel it with all their might. The German defenses were daunting, with artillery, machine guns, and obstacles designed to inflict maximum casualties on the invading forces. The beaches were lined with barbed wire, mines, and other deadly traps, creating a perilous gauntlet for the soldiers to navigate. As the first wave of soldiers landed, they were met with a hail of gunfire. The air was filled with the deafening sounds of explosions and gunfire as the men fought their way onto the beaches, determined to establish a foothold despite the overwhelming odds. The beaches were littered with obstacles and mines, making every step a potential death trap. The soldiers had to navigate through a maze of barriers, all while under constant enemy fire. Their bravery and determination in the face of such adversity were nothing short of heroic. Casualties were heavy, but the Allies pressed on. Medics worked tirelessly to tend to the wounded, often risking their own lives to save others. The cost of the invasion was high, but the resolve of the Allied forces never wavered. They fought with courage and determination, gaining a foothold on French soil. The success of D-Day marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany as the Allies continued to push forward, liberating occupied territories and bringing hope to millions. While the war raged in Europe, a different kind of battle was unfolding in the Pacific. The United States was engaged in a brutal island-hopping campaign against Japan. The goal was to capture key islands and secure bases closer to the Japanese mainland. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa were particularly fierce. Japanese soldiers fought with fanatical resistance, often to the death. The fighting was characterized by hand-to-hand combat and heavy casualties on both sides. The Pacific War was a different kind of conflict. It was fought in jungles and on remote islands. The climate was unforgiving, diseases were rampant. The human cost of this war was immense. Section 4, pushing back the liberation of Europe. With the success of D-Day, Allied forces began their advance across Europe. They liberated Paris in August 1944. The spirit of resistance was strong. The French people welcomed their liberators with open arms. However, the war was far from over. The Germans fought tenaciously, determined to hold on to their conquests. Battles raged in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Each victory came at a high price. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was pushing back against the Germans on the Eastern Front. They had suffered unimaginable losses, but their resolve never wavered. The Red Army was a formidable force. They inflicted heavy casualties on the Germans. Section 5. The Battle of the Bulge, a last stand. In December 1944, the Germans launched a desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest. This was a meticulously planned operation codenamed Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine. The German High Command aimed to split the Allied forces, encircle and destroy 4 Allied armies, and capture the vital Belgian port of Antwerp. The stakes were incredibly high, as this offensive was seen as Germany's last chance to turn the tide of the war in their favor. This became known as the Battle of the Bulge. The name itself comes from the bulge that the German advance created in the Allied front lines. The Ardennes, a region of dense forests and rolling hills, was considered an unlikely spot for a major offensive due to its challenging terrain and harsh winter conditions. However, this element of surprise was precisely what the Germans were counting on. It was a last-ditch effort to break through the Allied lines and capture the port of Antwerp. The port was crucial for the Allies as it was a major supply hub. Capturing it would severely disrupt the Allied supply chain and potentially force them into a negotiated peace. The German forces, comprising over 200,000 troops and nearly 1,000 tanks, moved swiftly and with deadly precision. The battle took the Allies by surprise. Many American units were inexperienced and unprepared for the ferocity of the German assault. The initial German success was alarming, causing confusion and chaos among the Allied ranks. Communications were disrupted and many units found themselves isolated and surrounded. The weather also played a significant role, with heavy snowstorms grounding Allied air support and making resupply efforts extremely difficult. The fighting was fierce and often took place in blizzard conditions. The harsh winter weather added another layer of hardship to an already brutal conflict. Soldiers on both sides had to contend with freezing temperatures, deep snow, and limited visibility. The cold was so intense that weapons would jam and frostbite became a common affliction. Despite these challenges, the battle raged on with relentless intensity. American soldiers fought with incredible bravery and resilience, holding the line against determined German forces. Units like the 101st Airborne Division, famously known as the Screaming Eagles, played a pivotal role in the defense of key locations such as Bastogne. Despite being surrounded and outnumbered, they held their ground, exemplifying the tenacity and courage that would come to define the American effort in this battle. The Battle of the Bulge was a costly victory for the Allies. The fighting lasted for over a month, from December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, with the Allies losing approximately 75,000 men and the Germans around 100,000. The battle also resulted in significant material losses, with countless tanks, vehicles, and equipment destroyed. However, the Allies' ability to eventually repel the German offensive marked a turning point in the war. It depleted the last of the German reserves. The failure of the offensive left Germany critically weakened, both in terms of manpower and resources. The loss of experienced troops and valuable equipment meant that the German army could no longer mount any significant resistance against the advancing Allied forces. This depletion hastened the collapse of the German front lines and paved the way for the Allies to push into Germany itself. It hastened the end of the war in Europe. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated the resilience and determination of the Allied forces, who managed to turn a dire situation into a decisive victory. This victory not only boosted Allied morale, but also significantly weakened German resolve. With their last major offensive thwarted, the path to Berlin was now open, leading to the eventual surrender of Germany in May 1945. The courage and sacrifice of the soldiers who fought in those frozen forests would never be forgotten. Their actions during the Battle of the Bulge stand as a testament to the human spirit's capacity for endurance and bravery in the face of overwhelming odds. Memorials and commemorations continue to honor their legacy, ensuring that future generations remember the price of freedom and the heroism displayed during one of World War II's most pivotal battles. Section 6. The Fall of Berlin and the End in Europe. By the spring of 1945, the end was near for Nazi Germany. The once formidable Third Reich, which had spread its influence and terror across Europe, was now crumbling under the relentless pressure of the Allied forces. The German cities, once bustling with life, were now scenes of devastation and despair. The relentless bombings had reduced many of them to rubble, and the morale of the German people was at an all-time low. Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin from the east. The Red Army, having fought its way through Eastern Europe, was now poised to deliver the final blow to the Nazi regime. The streets of Berlin echoed with the sounds of artillery fire and the rumble of Soviet tanks. The German defenses, though still putting up a fierce resistance, were no match for the sheer numbers and determination of the Soviet troops. Allied armies were advancing from the west. American, British and other Allied forces had successfully breached the German defenses and were making rapid progress. The liberation of concentration camps and the discovery of the horrors within further fueled their resolve to bring an end to the Nazi tyranny. The Western Allies, with their superior air power and mechanized infantry, were steadily pushing the German forces back, capturing town after town. The once mighty Nazi war machine was on the verge of collapse. The German army, which had once seemed invincible, was now in full retreat. The relentless Allied bombings had decimated their supply lines, and the lack of resources was taking its toll. German soldiers, many of them young and inexperienced, were surrendering in droves. The once proud Luftwaffe was now a shadow of its former self, unable to defend the skies over Germany. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops fought their way into the heart of Berlin, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his underground bunker. The man who had plunged the world into war and orchestrated the Holocaust chose to end his life rather than face the consequences of his actions. His death marked the symbolic end of the Nazi regime. The remaining German leadership, realizing the futility of further resistance, began to seek ways to surrender. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 7, 1945. The signing of the surrender documents took place in a small schoolhouse in Reims, France. General Alfred Jodl, representing the German High Command, signed the documents in the presence of Allied officers. The news of the surrender spread quickly, and celebrations erupted across the Allied nations. The long and brutal conflict in Europe had finally come to an end. The war in Europe was finally over. Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day, was celebrated on May 8, 1945. In cities across Europe and North America, people took to the streets to celebrate the end of the war. There were parades, fireworks, and joyous gatherings as people expressed their relief and happiness. The sense of victory was palpable, but so was the awareness of the immense sacrifices that had been made. The victory in Europe was met with jubilation and relief. Families who had been separated by the war were reunited, and soldiers who had fought bravely on the front lines returned home to their loved ones. The streets were filled with laughter, music, and dancing. It was a time of great joy, but also a time of reflection. The war had left deep scars, and the process of healing and rebuilding was just beginning. However, the celebrations were tempered by the sobering realization of the war's immense cost. Millions had perished, cities lay in ruins. The scale of the destruction was almost unimaginable. Entire communities had been wiped out, and the infrastructure of many countries was in shambles. The human cost was staggering, with countless lives lost and many more forever changed by the horrors they had witnessed. The world was forever changed. The end of the war marked the beginning of a new era. The task of rebuilding Europe was daunting, but there was also a sense of hope and determination. Nations came together to rebuild and to ensure that such a conflict would never happen again. The lessons learned from the war would shape the future, and the sacrifices made would never be forgotten. The fall of Berlin and the end of the war in Europe were not just the end of a conflict, but the beginning of a new chapter in human history.